I was only holding a receipt, but in that moment, it felt like the entire room had already decided I was guilty. The words hung in the air of the upscale department store as Alicia Monroe stood near the marble counter, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm but unreadable. Around her, shoppers slowed their movements, sensing something unusual unfolding beneath the soft background music and polished elegance of the store. A security associate stood near the display case, pointing subtly toward a small item missing from its stand, a luxury accessory valued at several $100s, while his voice carried just enough certainty to shape the atmosphere in the room. Alicia wore a simple, well-fitted coat, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention, and that simplicity seemed to work against her in the eyes of those watching. Within seconds, the situation had shifted from quiet suspicion to silent accusation, as if the environment itself had begun to assign meaning before any facts were confirmed. From the entrance of the store, Officer Daniel Carter stepped inside, his presence immediately altering the emotional temperature of the space. His posture was controlled, his expression neutral but firm, trained to respond first to reports before interpretations. He approached the counter where the issue was being described, listening carefully as the security associate repeated the claim, his tone confident and unchanging. The missing item, the brief moment of distraction, the direction of attention all formed a narrative that appeared complete enough to act upon. Carter's eyes moved toward Alicia, assessing her without hostility, but with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to resolving disputes quickly and decisively in public environments. Alicia met his gaze without stepping back, without raising her voice, without offering anything beyond steady eye contact that made it difficult to label her emotion. The surrounding customers began to form a loose circle of attention, some pretending not to watch while clearly absorbing every detail of the unfolding moment. The store's lighting reflected off polished surfaces, making the space feel sharper, more exposed, as if there was no place for uncertainty to hide. Carter raised a hand slightly, signaling procedural control rather than accusation, but the message was clear: the situation had entered enforcement protocol. Alicia remained still, her presence contrasting sharply with the growing tension around her, as though she existed slightly outside the rhythm of assumption and reaction. No one yet knew who she was beyond what they thought they saw, and that gap between perception and reality was about to widen in ways none of them expected. The atmosphere inside the department store shifted further as Officer Daniel Carter moved into a more structured position of control, subtly guiding the situation from observation into formal procedure. His attention remained on Alicia Monroe, but his focus was not accusatory in tone, rather procedural, shaped by training that prioritized immediate stabilization of uncertain situations. The security associate continued to describe the missing item, reinforcing a timeline of events that appeared straightforward on the surface, yet carried an underlying pressure that influenced how everyone in the vicinity interpreted silence and stillness. Alicia remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that contrasted with the growing assumption forming around her. She did not interrupt, did not attempt to fill the silence with explanations, and that restraint began to affect how the room perceived her, as if confidence without immediate defense created its own form of suspicion. Carter raised his voice slightly, not aggressively, but clearly enough to establish procedural authority, asking for clarification regarding the moment the item was last seen and whether surveillance coverage had already been reviewed. The security associate nodded quickly, indicating partial review of camera footage, though the confirmation lacked precision, relying more on assumption than verified detail. Around them, shoppers adjusted their position subtly, some stepping closer while others pretended to disengage, yet all attention remained anchored to the unfolding interaction. Alicia's gaze briefly shifted toward the display counter where the item had been located, then returned to Carter, her expression unchanged but observant, as if she was tracking not only the situation but the structure of how it was being constructed. The lighting in the store remained bright and uniform, highlighting every movement, every pause, and every glance, making the environment feel almost like a controlled stage where interpretation could easily replace fact. Carter took a half-step closer to the counter, maintaining professional distance but increasing engagement, his tone shifting into verification mode as he requested identification and clarification of purchase history. The request was standard procedure in situations involving disputed property, yet its delivery in a public space naturally intensified the attention of those nearby. Alicia did not reach for her belongings immediately, instead allowing a brief silence to settle, a silence that carried more weight than any immediate response could have. That silence created a subtle tension in the room, not from resistance, but from the absence of expected reaction. Carter observed this carefully, noting her composure, yet still operating within the framework of initial reports that suggested theft. The environment held steady, but beneath its surface, assumptions were beginning to solidify, shaping the direction of the encounter before all evidence had been fully examined. Nothing had escalated beyond control, yet the situation had clearly moved beyond uncertainty into a structured moment of judgment awaiting resolution. The interaction inside the department store deepened as Officer Daniel Carter maintained a controlled procedural stance, now transitioning from initial response into a more structured verification phase. His attention alternated between Alicia Monroe and the security associate, carefully weighing the consistency of the verbal account against the limited information available at that moment. The environment remained steady in appearance, yet the psychological weight of the situation increased as more people subtly gathered at a distance, their curiosity shaping a silent audience around the unfolding event. Alicia continued to stand in place without visible agitation, her calm demeanor becoming more noticeable as the procedural steps progressed, creating a contrast between expectation and behavior that Carter could not ignore. The security associate gestured toward the display area again, emphasizing the missing item's location, while also referencing partial camera review that had not yet been fully confirmed by store management. Carter raised his hand slightly to pause further explanation, indicating the need for structured verification before any formal conclusion could be reached. He then requested access to full surveillance footage and transaction logs, his tone steady and professional, ensuring that the process remained within standard protocol rather than assumption-based escalation. Alicia's gaze shifted briefly toward Carter as he spoke, then toward the surrounding environment, as if observing not only the people involved but the system of interpretation forming around her presence. The store's lighting remained unchanged, but the perception of space felt increasingly narrow as attention concentrated toward the center of the counter area where the initial claim had originated. Carter reviewed preliminary notes on his device, confirming that no immediate confirmation of wrongdoing had been established beyond the initial report, yet procedural obligation required continued engagement until clarity was achieved. Alicia finally spoke in a calm and even tone, offering a simple statement that she had not interacted with any merchandise beyond what she had already purchased, her words measured and without emotional escalation. The room reacted subtly, not through overt change but through shifting attention, as observers recalibrated their interpretation of her silence and composure in response to direct questioning. Carter acknowledged her statement without acceptance or dismissal, maintaining neutral procedural posture as he awaited additional data from store systems. The security associate appeared momentarily uncertain, glancing toward the counter and then toward Carter, as if reconsidering the certainty of the initial assumption. The tension in the room was no longer driven by accusation alone, but by the growing gap between initial perception and the absence of confirmed evidence. Alicia remained steady, her presence unchanged, while Carter continued to operate within structured protocol, aware that the next phase of verification would determine whether the situation would escalate or dissolve. The environment held in a state of suspended resolution, where every participant understood that the truth had not yet fully emerged, but was already beginning to shift the direction of everything around them. The verification process inside the department store reached a more defined procedural stage as Officer Daniel Carter shifted his focus toward consolidated data confirmation, waiting for full surveillance access and transaction records to arrive from the store's internal system. The atmosphere remained controlled, yet the emotional pressure in the space subtly increased as uncertainty stretched longer than expected, causing observers to remain fixed on the central counter area where Alicia Monroe stood. Her composure had not changed since the beginning of the interaction, but that very consistency now became the focal point of attention, as people around her began to reassess the assumptions that had formed in the early moments of the accusation. Carter maintained a neutral stance, reviewing incoming partial data on his device, noting that the surveillance feed currently available did not clearly support the certainty of the initial claim. The security associate, who had originally reported the missing item, now appeared less confident, occasionally glancing at the display case and then back at the officer, as if trying to reconcile memory with incomplete evidence. Alicia remained silent for several seconds, her posture steady and grounded, her eyes moving briefly across the environment as if observing not only the people present but the structure of the process unfolding around her. The store manager arrived at the counter area shortly after, carrying access credentials for the full system review, and immediately began assisting Carter in retrieving the complete footage timeline. As the video feed began to load on a nearby monitor, attention in the room narrowed further, shifting away from verbal accounts and toward visual confirmation. Carter's expression remained controlled as he watched the initial playback segment, which showed customer movement and staff activity prior to the moment the item was reported missing. Alicia did not react, maintaining the same calm presence she had held since the beginning, her silence now interpreted differently by those observing as the evidence review progressed. The manager pointed out timestamps and camera angles, attempting to align the reported sequence of events with the visual record, but the footage required careful analysis due to overlapping movement in the display area. Carter raised a hand slightly, indicating that all conclusions must remain on hold until the full sequence was reviewed in continuity rather than isolated segments. The surrounding customers remained quiet, their attention fixed on the unfolding verification process, as the initial certainty that had shaped the moment began to weaken under the weight of incomplete confirmation. Alicia finally shifted her stance slightly, not in reaction to accusation, but as a natural adjustment during prolonged stillness, her expression still composed and unreadable. The screen continued to display footage sequences, revealing gaps in attention and overlapping customer interactions that made the exact origin of the missing item unclear at that stage of review. Carter remained focused, recognizing that procedural integrity required full clarity before any determination could be made, regardless of initial reports. The tension in the room did not disappear, but it changed form, transforming from certainty of accusation into uncertainty of interpretation, where every observer now waited for the system of evidence to speak more clearly than assumption had allowed. The situation remained unresolved, but the direction of understanding was beginning to shift in a way that no longer aligned with the original claim. The verification process inside the department store reached a critical interpretive stage as Officer Daniel Carter carefully examined the full surveillance timeline now playing across the store's central monitor system. The earlier certainty that had driven the initial accusation was beginning to lose structural support as more continuous footage revealed inconsistencies in the reported sequence of events. Alicia Monroe remained in the same position near the counter area, her presence steady and composed, offering no disruption to the ongoing review process, yet her calmness now contrasted even more strongly against the uncertainty developing within the evidence itself. The store manager adjusted the playback controls, scrubbing through timestamps to align customer movement with the moment the item was reported missing, while Carter maintained strict focus on the screen, ensuring that no interpretation was made before the full sequence was confirmed. The security associate who had initially raised the concern now stood slightly farther back, his earlier confidence reduced into cautious observation as the footage continued to challenge the clarity of his recollection. Alicia briefly shifted her gaze toward the monitor, not with concern, but with patient attention, as if acknowledging that the system of verification was finally beginning to replace assumption with structured review. The footage showed overlapping customer interactions around the display area, with multiple brief moments where visibility of the item was partially obstructed, making the exact moment of disappearance less definitive than initially reported. Carter narrowed his focus, requesting a frame-by-frame review of the critical interval, his tone steady and procedural, ensuring that the evaluation remained objective and complete. The surrounding customers had become noticeably quieter, their attention now fixed not on accusation but on the unfolding clarification process, where the outcome was no longer predictable based on the initial claim. Alicia remained silent, her posture unchanged, embodying a level of restraint that contrasted with the shifting uncertainty around her, while the store environment itself seemed to settle into a more careful rhythm as judgment paused in favor of verification. The manager highlighted additional camera angles from adjacent sections of the store, revealing that movement near the display case had been partially obscured by passing shoppers during the critical timeframe. Carter acknowledged the new data, recognizing that the initial report lacked full contextual confirmation and required revision based on complete visual evidence. The emotional tone of the room began to shift subtly, as the weight of assumption loosened and replaced itself with analytical observation. No conclusion had yet been officially stated, but the direction of understanding was no longer aligned with the original accusation, and the situation had entered a phase where truth depended entirely on verified continuity rather than immediate perception. Alicia's calm presence remained unchanged as the system of review continued to unfold, and the environment waited for final confirmation to determine what had actually occurred within the boundaries of recorded evidence. The department store review process reached its most decisive phase as Officer Daniel Carter observed the full continuous surveillance sequence now playing without interruption across the central monitoring screen. The environment had shifted from uncertainty to structured analysis, where every second of footage carried equal weight in determining the final interpretation of the incident. Alicia Monroe remained near the counter area, her posture unchanged, her presence calm and stable, as if unaffected by the gradual unraveling of the initial accusation. The store manager continued adjusting playback controls, carefully aligning multiple camera angles to reconstruct a complete timeline of movement around the display case. As the footage progressed, it became increasingly evident that the original claim lacked a singular defining moment that clearly indicated wrongdoing, instead revealing a series of overlapping customer interactions that introduced ambiguity into the initial narrative. Carter leaned slightly closer to the monitor, focusing on the precise interval where the item was believed to have gone missing, requesting slow frame analysis to eliminate assumptions based on incomplete visibility. The security associate, who had first reported the incident, now appeared increasingly uncertain, his earlier confidence replaced with restrained silence as the evidence failed to fully support his original statement. Alicia briefly shifted her attention toward the screen, maintaining the same composed expression, showing no sign of urgency or concern, as though the process unfolding around her was simply a matter of formal clarification rather than personal defense. The surrounding customers had grown quieter, their earlier curiosity now replaced by attentive observation of the verification process itself, which had become the central focus of the space. The manager pointed out additional camera coverage from a secondary angle, revealing partial obstruction during the critical time frame due to customer movement near the display section, further complicating the ability to identify a precise moment of disappearance. Carter acknowledged the discrepancy without immediate conclusion, reinforcing procedural discipline by ensuring that no determination would be made until all available footage had been reviewed in full continuity. The emotional atmosphere in the store had noticeably shifted, moving away from presumption and toward analytical caution, as the absence of definitive evidence began to reshape the perception of the entire situation. Alicia's calm demeanor remained constant, her silence no longer interpreted through suspicion alone, but increasingly viewed as consistent with someone confident in the eventual outcome of verified review. The system of evaluation continued without interruption, with each frame reinforcing the need for careful interpretation rather than immediate judgment. Carter maintained focus, recognizing that procedural integrity required complete clarity before any action could be finalized, regardless of the initial report. As the footage reached its concluding segments, the structure of the incident no longer aligned with the original accusation, and the environment collectively entered a state of suspended conclusion, awaiting final confirmation based on evidence rather than assumption. The surveillance review inside the department store reached its turning point as Officer Daniel Carter completed the final verification pass through the continuous footage sequence. The room remained quiet, with attention fully concentrated on the central monitor where the reconstructed timeline now displayed a coherent flow of events. Alicia Monroe stood in the same position near the counter area, her calm presence unchanged, offering no reaction beyond quiet observation as the process moved toward conclusion. The store manager, positioned beside Carter, carefully replayed the final segment once more, ensuring that no detail was missed before any formal determination was made. As the footage reached its most critical interval, it became increasingly clear that the original accusation did not align with the complete visual record. The sequence showed multiple customer interactions and overlapping movements around the display case, but no definitive action that supported the certainty of the initial claim. Carter maintained a steady focus, analyzing each frame with procedural discipline, confirming that the absence of clear evidence required the case to be reassessed under standard protocol. The security associate, now visibly subdued in demeanor, remained silent as the implications of the review became increasingly apparent, his earlier confidence fully replaced by uncertainty. Alicia's expression remained composed and steady, her posture unchanged, as the environment around her transitioned from scrutiny to reconsideration. The surrounding customers, who had remained attentive throughout the process, now appeared to sense the shift in direction as the footage consistently failed to substantiate the original report. Carter paused briefly at the final timestamp, reviewing the complete sequence one last time to ensure procedural accuracy before making any statement. The store manager confirmed that no additional footage or alternate angles showed any conclusive evidence of wrongdoing, reinforcing the findings already observed on the primary feed. The atmosphere in the store shifted noticeably, moving from tension and uncertainty into a quieter state of resolution, where the absence of evidence itself became the defining outcome. Alicia remained still, her calm presence now interpreted through the lens of confirmed review rather than initial suspicion. Carter straightened slightly, acknowledging internally that the procedural requirements for verification had been met, and that the situation no longer supported the original assumption. The environment settled into a collective pause, as those present processed the implications of what had been reviewed, where interpretation had given way to documented clarity. The incident, once shaped by accusation, now stood redefined by the absence of proof, leaving only the structured conclusion of the verification process to guide what would come next. The final phase of the department store incident unfolded as Officer Daniel Carter formally completed the procedural review and transitioned from observation to resolution. The surveillance system had already confirmed the absence of any definitive evidence supporting the initial accusation, and now the remaining step was documentation and clarification for all parties involved. The atmosphere in the store remained quiet, with customers still gathered at a respectful distance, watching as the situation moved toward its conclusion. Alicia Monroe stood near the counter area exactly as she had throughout the entire process, her calm presence unchanged, now framed by a developing sense of clarity rather than uncertainty. Carter closed the playback on the monitor after one final confirmation of the timeline, then turned slightly toward the store manager and security associate, signaling that the review process had reached its end. He stated in a steady and professional tone that the evidence did not support the original claim, and that no verified indication of wrongdoing had been found within the reviewed footage or transaction records. The security associate remained silent, his posture lowered slightly as the implications of the findings settled into full recognition. The store manager acknowledged the conclusion and began noting procedural updates to reflect the corrected assessment of events. Carter then turned his attention toward Alicia, maintaining formal protocol as he prepared to conclude the interaction. At that moment, Alicia reached into her personal identification case and calmly presented official credentials for verification, which Carter accepted and reviewed with careful attention. As he scanned the document, his expression shifted subtly into recognition, acknowledging the formal designation indicated within the credentials, which confirmed her position as a federal judge. The realization immediately reframed the entire sequence of events, not through emotion, but through procedural understanding of the oversight that had occurred in the initial assumption. Carter maintained professionalism as he returned the identification and acknowledged her status respectfully, ensuring that all protocol standards were correctly observed in light of the updated information. The surrounding environment remained still, with the earlier tension fully replaced by a quiet sense of reflection among those who had witnessed the progression from assumption to verification. Alicia's demeanor did not change in response to the recognition, her composure remaining steady and measured, reinforcing the consistency she had shown throughout the entire interaction. The store manager expressed formal acknowledgement of the clarified outcome, while the security associate remained respectfully silent, now fully aware of the procedural misjudgment that had initiated the incident. Carter completed the final notes in his report, ensuring that the record reflected the verified facts without speculation or assumption, consistent with required standards. The situation, once defined by accusation, had now been fully redefined by documented truth and confirmed identity, leaving no unresolved elements within the procedural framework. As Carter stepped back from the counter area, the environment in the store settled into normal activity once again, with the earlier intensity fully dissolved into quiet continuation of routine, marking the conclusion of the event under complete and verified resolution. The department store incident concluded in a calm and structured resolution as Officer Daniel Carter finalized his report and confirmed that all procedural requirements had been fully satisfied. The environment, which had earlier been shaped by uncertainty and attention, now returned to its normal operational rhythm as customers gradually dispersed and store staff resumed routine responsibilities. Alicia Monroe remained near the counter for a brief moment after the formal acknowledgement of her identity, her presence steady and unchanged, reflecting a composed dignity that had remained consistent throughout every stage of the process. Carter stood nearby completing the final administrative entries, ensuring that the official record accurately reflected the verified sequence of events, the absence of supporting evidence for the initial claim, and the corrected understanding established through full surveillance review. The store manager reviewed the completed notes with careful attention, confirming that internal documentation aligned with procedural standards and that no further action was required from store security. The security associate, now quiet and reflective, accepted the outcome without further comment, recognizing the importance of accurate verification in situations shaped by incomplete initial information. Alicia offered a brief, professional acknowledgement of the conclusion, her tone calm and measured, without emphasis or emotional reaction, reinforcing the steady composure she had maintained from the beginning. Carter responded with formal respect, ensuring that all interactions concluded within appropriate procedural conduct, and then stepped back to allow normal activity to resume. The surrounding space gradually shifted from focused observation to everyday movement, as the earlier tension fully dissolved into the background of routine store life. Customers who had witnessed the process began to disperse, their attention no longer fixed on the counter area, but instead returning to their own activities within the store. The lighting, sound, and movement of the environment regained their ordinary rhythm, marking a clear transition from incident review to operational normalcy. Alicia adjusted her position slightly, preparing to leave the area, her presence still calm and composed as she moved beyond the center of attention. Carter completed his final acknowledgement of closure within the system, confirming that the case was resolved strictly on verified evidence and documented findings. As Alicia exited the counter area and proceeded toward the store exit, the final impression left among those present was not defined by accusation, but by the structured correction of assumption through verified truth. The incident concluded without further disruption, leaving behind a clear procedural record and a restored sense of order within the environment, as normal activity resumed completely and the moment became part of routine history within the store's daily operations.